Today we're talking about Taiwan and mainland China. For those of you who may not be very familiar with the background, I will provide some historical background and then get to the issue of where does this relationship go from here. China had a civil war between 1946 and 1949, and the outcome of which was the victory of the Chinese Communist Party and the departure of the nationalist government from the mainland to Taiwan. The status of Taiwan was very tricky. It was ceded by China to Japan in 1896 after Japan defeated China in a major war. And then it became part of Japan's colonial empire. At the end of the war, the Allies simply declared that Japan should return the territory it occupied to China, to its rightful owner. But then China split. So the status of Taiwan, the legal status of Taiwan, was always ambiguous. When the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan, it insisted that it represented all of China, even though Taiwan was a very tiny island. And of course, the communist government that came to power in China as a result of its victory in the Chinese Civil War insisted that it represented all of China and Taiwan is part of China. So that dispute caught somebody else in between. That was the US. Because during the Chinese Civil War, the US supported the nationalists. And after the nationalists returned to Taiwan for a while, it seemed that the US would not defend Taiwan. But something else happened, the Korean War. After the North Koreans attacked South Korea, President Harry Truman sending the 7th Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait. And that effectively ended any hope that mainland China could conquer Taiwan militarily. For a while, before the mid-1950s, I think it's October 90, before the end of the 50s, China was actually engaged in a very serious military preparation to conquer Taiwan. But of course, after the Korean War broke out and the patrol of the 7th Fleet, that was over. So let's just roll back to the 1970s. A long-standing obstacle in restoring relationship, the diplomatic relationship between China and the US was the status of Taiwan. The US felt that it was honor-bound not to abandon a long-time ally. But China's position was that you either have to end your relationship with Taiwan and then acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China before you could normalize a full diplomatic relationship with Beijing. It was resolved, this impasse was resolved with one of the most creative diplomatic solutions history has ever known. It's called the Shanghai Communique. And the policy is called One China policy. And the gist of it that Washington does not take a position on whether Taiwan is part of China or not. But Washington acknowledges China's view that Taiwan is part of China. It does not say accept whether that's true or not. And it further acknowledges that this view comes from the fact that the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait acknowledge there is only one China. And in terms of practicalities, in 1979, the US withdrew its armed forces from Taiwan, ended its official relationship with Taiwan, moved its recognition to China, but it left one thing behind. That is, it was afraid that Taiwan would be abandoned completely and Taiwan would be militarily vulnerable to China. So in restoring relationship with China, the US passed one law called the Taiwan Relations Act. It covers many areas but two deserve special mention. One is that it explicitly says that Taipei-Washington relationship is unofficial. It's not official. But it also says that Washington has an obligation to ensure the security of Taiwan. Specifically, it will continue to supply arms to Taiwan. And in the case of a Chinese military, an attempt to coerce Taiwan by China, or some embargo against Taiwan, the U.S. will view any such development with grave concern. Again, very ambiguous, and the president will be required to consult Congress about this. So it all sounds like, if you look at this, it might appear to be some kind of promise to defend Taiwan, but it can also be viewed as not a promise. So it's very ambiguous. It both allowed, on the good side, it allowed the U.S. to maintain some kind of relationship with Taiwan, but also will not allow this relationship to obstruct any expansion of ties with China. Worked very well for many years. Worked very well from 1979 until, I think, mid-1990s. So we're talking about 16 years. It was a very creative solution. But something happened in the mid-1990s. Taiwan became democratized. And of course, democracy does many good things. One thing it doesn't do very well is to unleash ethno-nationalism. If you, again, know something about Taiwan, is that about 70%, 75% of the population are so-called native Taiwanese. They speak a different language. Their ancestors came from mainland China, but came many, many years ago. And the generation that was going to take power in the 1990s, the natives, they grew up under Japanese rule. Many of them did not even speak Mandarin Chinese. Their first language, for example, President Lee Teng-hui, who became president in 1988, speaks more fluent Japanese than he does Chinese. And many of them do not identify as themselves as Chinese. So you have a major problem of national identity. And democracy allows the expression of a separate identity. And then Mr. Lee himself became actually a champion of Taiwanese identity. And in 1995, there was a very famous incident. He lobbied, his people lobbied the U.S. Congress to allow him to come to the U.S. because between China and the U.S., there was an implicit agreement. 4 people would not be allowed into the U.S. from Taiwan: the president, the vice president, the premier, the vice premier. It was never written into law, but Taiwan lobbied Congress very successfully, and Congress pressured President Clinton to allow him to come to Cornell. Mr. Lee was a Ph.D. in agroeconomics from Cornell, ostensibly to deliver a keynote address at their ceremony, at their graduation ceremony. China was very upset. China warned that this was going to be very serious, and Mr. Lee came and he delivered what was viewed a very inflammatory speech that championed Taiwanese identity, and that was viewed in Beijing as openly challenging China's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. And and that was a pivotal event in China's relationship with Taiwan. And since then, China thought it had to demonstrate its resolve to prevent Taiwan from going farther down that road. So in 1996, it was another very dangerous incident. Taiwan was having the first genuinely free presidential elections since democracy began in March, and China wanted to show that it would not sit idle by if Taiwan declares independence, because it was viewed as an act of declaring sovereignty, because only a sovereign country can elect its chief executive. So China staged a large-scale military exercise. One part of the exercise was missile testing, and the missiles were fired into southern part of waters south of Taiwan and north of Taiwan, just show that China could actually block shipping into Taiwan, and that caused a panic. And the U.S., of course, responded by sending 2 aircraft carrier groups to the Taiwan Strait, and China could not do anything. At the time, China's military was not modernized. So then it began about sort of a decade, a very dangerous relationship between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, because China's response to the presence of American aircraft carrier groups was twofold. First of all, China did not escalate, but China reached a very important decision, is that in the future it had to prevent the U.S. from coming to Taiwan. So China launched a very steady program of military modernization focused on sinking American aircraft battle groups. And then today China probably has the capability of preventing American intervention. And then in Taiwan, they viewed, the pro-independence forces viewed American intervention as a sign that the U.S. actually was going to intervene. So it was very dangerous. You see the dangerous dynamics at work. The U.S. simply did what it thought it should do, that is preventing a very dangerous situation from escalating further. China thought the U.S. was interfering in an area China views as vitally important to its national dignity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And the pro-independence forces in Taiwan saw, wow, the U.S. finally is going to come to our side. So the next 10 years saw very dangerous developments, both in Taiwan and on the mainland of China, because China began to give up hope that Taiwan could be preserved through peaceful means. So China embarked on a steady modernization program, naval, just bought Russian submarines, missiles, aircraft. In Taiwan, meantime, in 2000, the pro-independence opposition party called Democratic Progressive Party came to power. And that accelerated the move toward legal independence or de jure independence, because all these years Taiwan has enjoyed so-called de facto independence. So Taiwan is by all intents and purposes an independent country, except that the U.S. does not recognize it, the UN does not recognize it, most of the countries in the world does not recognize, except for something like 30 countries, until very recently recognized Taiwan as a legitimate government. To cut the story short, by the time Taiwan had the last presidential election, that's 2 years ago, there was a live possibility that military conflict in Taiwan, involving not just Taiwan and China, but the U.S., could break out. Luckily, democracy in Taiwan prevailed, because Taiwanese voters, the majority of them, are very moderate. They want the status quo. They do not want a war with China, which would be devastating to both Taiwan and China. And also, the pro-independence government did not do a good job maintaining Taiwan's economic prosperity and growth, because it focused all its attention on trying to cut off the economic ties Taiwan has developed with China. It's a sort of two-track story. On the one hand, you saw political relationship deteriorating, military confrontation looming. On the other hand, Taiwan's private sector, Taiwan's business people are very worldly. They saw the writing on the wall in terms of economics. They understand that China in the 90s, since 1992, the Chinese economy began to grow very, very rapidly, and China became part of the global production chain. And Taiwan faced economically an existential choice. It either had to become economically irrelevant because the global economy and Asia's regional economy was coalescing around China. China gradually became the center of production for manufactured goods around the world. Taiwan either had to be close to China or become irrelevant. And despite government restrictions on investment, on travel, Taiwan's business people began to invest in China, move their factories to China. Of course, their investments have further made China a very competitive place for producing anything from notebook, computers to bicycles. And so this, by the time that the DPP won its re-election in 2004 under very strange circumstances. I will talk about this later on, but by the time that the 2008 election came along, the Taiwan's electorate had enough of the pro-independence government because on the one hand, they made life really dangerous for Taiwan. On the other hand, they did not develop the economy. And of course, in addition, the government was involved in several high-profile scandals. By the way, the former president of Taiwan, Chen Shui-bian, and his wife are now serving life terms for corruption. They were found to have stashed away millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts. But also in the process, they thoroughly antagonized the U.S. because the U.S.'s position on Taiwan, as we now know, is very ambiguous. It does not want China to use force to absorb Taiwan, but it doesn't want Taiwan to do anything that will force the U.S. to engage in a military conflict with China. A good analogy is that the U.S. is an insurance company. Okay? When you write insurance, you know you expect the insured to behave in a certain way. Otherwise, you increase the so-called moral hazards. The person who buys the insurance will behave irresponsibly. In other words, there is no blank check. But in this case, Taiwan under the independence, democratic, progressive government thought it had an unconditional pledge from the U.S. So in trying to elevate its legal status and then just push the envelope, as the saying goes, Taipei alienated the Bush administration. And Bush was the most pro-Taiwan president the U.S. has had since Jimmy Carter. So, the policy actually was rejected both by the voters and by Washington. So the Democratic Progressive Party left office in a very weakened shape. And of course, the departure of the pro-independence government in Taiwan created a historic opportunity for Beijing and Taipei to work out some of their differences. The party that replaced the pro-independence party is called the Nationalists. And the irony of history is that the Nationalists were denounced as the communists' worst enemies when they were governing China. Now they're embraced as the Communist Party's best buddies. Go figure. So as soon as the new KMT government came to power, Beijing and Taipei began to improve relations, just put into execution very specific steps, starting in May 2008. So we're talking about 20 months ago. Taiwan allowed and China reached agreements to allow commercial aviation, passenger flights, cargo flights, direct cargo flights to to be resumed between the island and mainland. As a result, economic ties became closer because Taiwan now has 80,000 businesses operating in China. Think about the human the passenger traffic. It not only cut down the time needed for Taiwanese businessmen to go to China. Before direct flights were allowed, it took almost a day for a Taiwanese businessman to go from Taiwan to a city in China, because they had to go through Hong Kong. And of course, that created a unique problem called mainland mistress problem. Many of the business people, their families, are left on Taiwan, so they accumulated not only wealth but mistresses on the mainland. But once the resumption of flights began, that problem was severely sort of curtailed, because now they don't need to stay in China. They can actually go back the same day, because now it takes only an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to Chinese cities. And Taiwan now depends on China for its economic survival, because 50% of Taiwan's exports go to China. And Taiwan has invested something like $60 billion in China. At least that's the official figure. I think the real figure probably is higher. So the improvement in political ties has now allowed Taiwan to be economically more competitive, because this arrangement really maximizes Taiwan's economic competitiveness. That is, Taiwan is a very innovative economy, and it can focus on the high-end R&D, but outsource manufacturing to China. In addition, they've stopped the so-called diplomatic warfare. Before the improvement in 2008, China and Taiwan were engaged in a laughable and wasteful competition for diplomatic partners. China wanted to make sure that Taiwan had no diplomatic partners left. There would be no country in the world that would recognize Taiwan as a legitimate government, because that's international delegitimation. If you know anything about sovereignty or international legal recognition, you can declare independence. But if you have no other country in the world that acknowledge that you are an independent country, it's not as good. It's no good at all. So that was China's, and of course Taiwan would not allow that to happen. So what happens is that China would go to one of the few countries, basically in Central America, Caribbean, and Africa. These are all very poor, small countries. And China would say, what's your price? Name your price. You switch your diplomatic recognition, how much do you want? So the guy would say, maybe $1 billion. China would say, here's $1 billion. And then the country concerned would go to Taipei and say, Beijing has offered me $1 billion. Can you top the price? And then if initially Taiwan actually could beat back. But then toward the late 1990s, sort of the last decade, the middle of last decade, China could outbid any price Taiwan was willing to offer. So Taiwan was losing a lot of diplomatic allies toward the end of the last decade. But the good thing is that as soon as the KMT government came to power, they stopped that silly business. And of course, China toned down. China also allowed Taiwan to become an observer member of the WHO, World Health Organization. All this matters for the government in Taiwan, because it wants to show that engagement with China, reconciliation with China, actually can get Taiwan what it could not get under a pro-independence government. Because under pro-independence government, China would simply do everything it could to squeeze Taiwan. Now China would give Taiwan a little bit of diplomatic space, as they call it. And now China and Taiwan are talking about setting up a free trade agreement. Because China has free trade agreement with ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, New Zealand, and is negotiating one with Australia, and probably will negotiate one with South Korea. It makes sense for Taiwan to have sort of a closer economic partnership with China. And if that happens, of course, it will be another milestone. And China appears to be now more patient about a final settlement of the relationship with Taiwan. I recently heard from somebody from Taiwan that in his New Year's speech, President Hu Jintao of China did not mention the crucial phrase, peaceful reunification. I have to check myself. If that's the case, it's a serious sign. If that phrase stops appearing, that means China has now changed its policy about reunification. It will be willing to tolerate the status quo. So we'll see. That may not be the case. I'm highly suspicious because that's such a fundamental change of policy. But problems remain. That is, within Taiwan, the DPP is down but not out. Its core constituency remains very anti-China, very nationalistic, and they are firmly opposed to reconciliation with China. Taiwan's public is moderate but does not want the government to go too far. It does not want the government to start negotiating a political settlement with China. And another problem is that economic relationship is moving forward. The diplomatic ceasefire is holding, but China has not done something on the military front that would reassure the Taiwanese public and gives acknowledged concerns of President Ma. That is, President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan openly called on Beijing to withdraw some of the missiles, about 1,000 missiles China has deployed targeting Taiwan since the mid-1990s. These are mobile missiles. It's quite easy to withdraw them, but China, for some unknown reasons, has refused to take that step. And that has undercut President Ma Ying-jeou's position. And of course, that underscored, that reinforced the suspicion in Taiwan that China has not really given up on its military threat against Taiwan. So we'll have to see whether China actually gets it. Maybe in 2 years, when President Ma Ying-jeou is running for re-election, China will announce a big withdrawal just to show that China wants him to get re-elected. Taiwan and for the U.S., American position is again quite nuanced. It welcomes any reduction in tensions in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait. It welcomes improvement in economic relationship between Taipei and Beijing. But at the same time, it honors its part of the deal, selling arms to Taiwan. And that has got Beijing very, very upset because China thinks that the U.S. may be against this progress, the process of reconciliation between China and Taiwan. That's why the U.S. sends out this political message. Selling arms to Taiwan, of course, strengthens Taiwan's defense against China. So, but I think the U.S. does not have that position. Part of that is for economic reasons. It's a big deal. We're talking about $6 billion of weapons. And of course, the decision was made by Bush in 2001. So it's not news for China. And most of the weapons are defensive weapons that are not going to threaten China. And on top of that, China's military strength is far superior to Taiwan's, overall speaking, even though China's Air Force may not be as good as Taiwan's Air Force. But overall, the U.S. actually has confidence in Taiwan's democratic process. The U.S. is unlikely to interfere in the genuine political reconciliation process if the people in Taiwan have reached a consensus. So I think China's worries are probably unnecessary in this respect. However, the development in Taiwan does have one effect on U.S.-China relationship. That's for a long time, Taiwan was a very effective leverage the U.S. had against China, especially when Taiwan was controlled by a pro-independence government. Because China, this is really the soft spot in China's psychology. Any little thing Taiwan does can get the people in Beijing up the wall. Very, very angry, very, very nervous. But now they're not very nervous at all. So the U.S. does not have a lot of leverage over China these days. Not economically, not security issues. So the U.S. now finds China sort of a tougher nut to crack, so to speak. But overall, the development in Taiwan is good news for the U.S., for China, for Taiwan. Because for the next, I do not expect President Ma not to be re-elected. The pro-independence government, the party, has greatly been weakened. And President Ma Ying-jeou's policy overall toward China gets good marks. He's not getting good marks for his handling of some domestic policy issues, but people in Taiwan are genuinely positive about increasing relationship with China in the economic area. So I expect him to be re-elected. So we are looking ahead at least 6 more years of relative stability in the Taiwan Strait. And this is a period China needs to deal with domestic problems. The U.S. needs to get out of the current economic difficulties and the national security problems in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. So I guess I'll just stop here and take questions. Thank you.
So in your opinion, what factors could derail this positive movement that we've seen between these countries?
Oh yeah, I think from three directions. Okay. One direction is from China. That is, Chinese leaders may develop some unrealistic expectations that things are going so well, maybe we can get more than what we are getting. That means a political settlement between China and Taiwan. That some kind of Hong Kong plus model. You know about Hong Kong, 50 years, and nothing changes. They promised Taiwan that Taiwan can keep everything and its army, and there will be nothing. China will not send troops to Taiwan. In Hong Kong, actually, there were People's Liberation Army troops stationed in Hong Kong. So that may, if they do that, I think it will increase tensions because it would put the Ma government on the spot. And then another problem is that in the next, say, 2 years, the economy in Taiwan continues to do poorly. President Ma's reputation does not rise, and he faces a very strong challenger in the 2012 presidential election. And then the pro-independence party comes back to power. Then we're going to see another period of instability across the strait. And of course, U.S.-China relationship. If the U.S.-China relationship collapses, something that I give practically no probability for, it's just probably 0 probability, then of course, that can create tensions between the mainland and Taiwan.
I have a question here in the back. So you kind of mentioned something about Hong Kong there in the mix. Isn't it true that most of the manufactured goods that they're doing in China are within the special territories?
China began its opening to the outside world with so-called special economic zones, and one of them is next to Hong Kong called Shenzhen. After the mid-1990s, China just opened up every province. Guangdong, the Pearl River Delta, is now China's export center. Something like 80% of the microwaves of the world is made in one town, in probably 3 factories. But Hong Kong plays an important role in transshipping these manufactured goods to the rest of the world, because Hong Kong has the world's best container ports, and export servicing is world class. That's why things are made in China, they're shipped to Hong Kong, and then packaged and shipped to the rest of the world. Well, Japan has a, again, very, very delicate role, because Japan is seen by China as the country most responsible for the situation. Japan split, and Japan took Taiwan away from China 115 years ago. At that time, I read history that the person who negotiated with Japan, Prime Minister Li Hongzhang, offered Japan a lot of silver as war reparations and indemnity. Japan would not take any indemnification other than secession of the island. So Japan, but when President Lee Teng-hui was in power, of course he was very pro-Japanese. He worked very hard trying to get Japan into the picture. Japanese leaders were very wise. They stayed away from Taiwan as far as possible. And the US was very, very wise not to get Japan explicitly involved. There was one incident that really got China upset. That is, the US for a while wanted to make Japan, to use the Japan-US security alliance as a military deterrent against China. So in talking about the scope of their interest, once they mentioned Taiwan. And that was something that China viewed as sort of stepping out of the bound.
Two questions. One, why is it so important that Taiwan belongs to China? And two, if Taiwan was to be democratized, wouldn't it be better for everybody and save a lot of money?
No, it's, again, I think why China feels so strongly about Taiwan. I think only a Chinese can answer that question. And I've been away from China for so long that I think I appreciate the intensity of the feeling, because it symbolizes Chinese weakness. I mean, it's all that China was impotent to protect part of its territory. And now the pro-independence forces are not only challenging Chinese sovereignty, they are actually denouncing Chinese culture. They're using all kinds of terms that would make an average Chinese blood boil, really. And then think about Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party came to power as a party of Chinese nationalism. So how can a Chinese Communist Party continue to claim its legitimacy if it is powerless to prevent a tiny island from formally declaring independence from China? So all of this, political, emotional, historical reasons. As far as all this competition, yeah, I would say that probably the final resolution lies in the democracy in China. If China becomes a democratic country, maybe Taiwan and China will reach a final settlement. I just want to quip about one thing. I mentioned this at lunch with some of your colleagues here. Probably Taiwan can get a better deal with China when the communists are in charge, because the communists don't have to consult with anybody, right? Once China becomes a democracy, then it's a lot harder, because a lot of domestic politics. Why do you give Taiwan this and not a province in China, that kind of special status? Frankly, I think Hong Kong would not get the deal it got from China had China been a democracy, because the goodies Hong Kong gets from China. And Hong Kong is a society with $35,000 per capita income. China is 1/10 of that. Yeah?
I wonder what kind of information people in China have, if they have the same information about Taiwan.
No, they don't have the same information about Tibet. Well, I think that's a very sad situation, because history in China is very politicized. For example, the U.S. policy toward Taiwan is built upon so-called 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. They don't even know about Taiwan Relations Act, which of course is not favorable to China. They only know about the 3 documents signed between China and the U.S., which are favorable to China. So that's, again, it's something that we can do very little about. Only, as I said, when China becomes a genuinely democratic society, when its own people know about the true histories of their country, can we solve this problem? I mean, people like me, we know about this because we live here and we can get access to a real version of history. By the way, the problem is not unique to China. The problem is unique to Taiwan. In the case of Taiwan, it's not that information is restricted, but there's less of an interest in history. And also, on the pro-independence government, they stopped teaching about China. So that's why I think it will serve both sides as interest if the public becomes a lot more aware.
Do you think that with time, the fact that younger people will be taking over governmental posts and so on, that things might begin to change more quickly?
Yeah, well, I don't know much about Hong Kong. The only thing I know about Hong Kong is that the people in Hong Kong are very pragmatic. The first time I was in Hong Kong, 1994, very few people could speak Mandarin. And I had a hard time communicating in Mandarin. Of course, their English, the taxi driver's English was not good either. So you are stuck if you don't speak Cantonese. Now in Hong Kong, everybody speaks Mandarin. So people in Hong Kong adapt. And people in Hong Kong never question they are Chinese. I mean, the Chinese identity, cultural identity, they do not identify with the Communist Party, but they are very pragmatic. They know they're part of China now, so they remain politically inactive. Still, when elections come along, they vote for the pro-democracy parties. As far as Taiwan is concerned, I've looked at opinion polls, and this is something very interesting. The older generation are far more anti-China because they grew up under Japanese rule. They saw China was this backward country, chaotic, and very oppressive. They did not identify with China. Taiwan's younger generation is different. They did not have this Japanese colonial experience, and their impression of China is, again, different. A modernizing, fast-growing, strong country with enormous international power, prestige. So they are more pragmatic. Maybe that's where the hope lies.
My question is, what are China's long-term goals in the Middle East?
Okay. Yeah, this is I'm supposed to be a China expert. I'm not supposed to be a China Middle East expert. Well, let me just guess. I think they definitely want to have access to oil from the Middle East. As long as China depends on oil, and China is the world's second largest consumer of oil, imports something like 65% of its oil from the Middle East. So, but whether China wants to have puppet regimes, military bases in the Middle East, I don't think so. First of all, the U.S. has its own interests over there, and if China barges in, it will step on the toes of the Americans, and that's not going to look too good, and China probably doesn't need to do this. And on the other hand, China already has good ties with Saudi Arabia. If you were the Saudis, the last thing you want is that you have only one customer who wants to buy your oil. Now they want, so the Saudis are now supplying China, I think, the biggest supply of oil to China as well. So long-term goal, probably China, again, out of its self-interest, wants a relatively peaceful Middle East. But now, that's of course not the reality over there.
How would you gauge the approach of the Obama administration towards Taiwan and China against other presidencies?
So far, well, his China policy, I think, is okay. He's not made any major mistakes on the issue of Taiwan. So I think I wouldn't worry too much about a big mistake on his watch. He has very good advisors. Selling arms to Taiwan is something he has to do. It's on the agenda. Not doing it will cause him more problems than doing it.
What is the benefit for China to own the Taiwan? Okay. And the second question is, what is the benefit for you personally to say Taiwan is a part of China?
Did I say Taiwan is part of China? Well, if you want me to sort of, I can give you two sides of the story. If you want to say Taiwan, because people always selectively use history, okay? Taiwan was part of China for about 200, 300 years under the Qing dynasty. And then it ceased to be part of China from 1896 to 1945. That was part of Japanese. And then it was part of the Republic of China from 1945 to 1949, when the Republic of China included Taiwan and China. And then its status became very ambiguous. It was Republic of China, because what used to be Republic of China went to Taiwan. It was not part of the People's Republic of China, because it never conquered. So I think this version will stand under any scrutiny, right? Because it's a historically correct version. Part of China, because here the word is China. Again, if you proceed from that, from 1945, Taiwan has been part of China. The problem is that how do you define China? I wouldn't say Taiwan is a geographical concept. And if you use China, meaning China includes both Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, then Taiwan is part of China. That again, is not something any scholar would dispute, because it's not a political statement. It is simply it captures a historical fact. But I would never say Taiwan is part of the People's Republic of China, because that's not the case. Do you agree with that long-winded sort of a definition of what Taiwan is? I think this is a definition the U.S. government would accept, because it's true. It's a sort of a benefit China from Taiwan. I really don't know. I think, first of all, it's most countries would like to have undivided territories. Right? Taiwan are culturally part of China, historically part of China, so that's a natural thing. But Economically, I don't think makes any difference. Politically, in terms of security, then having Taiwan makes some difference because China can actually sort of go beyond an island chain that surrounds China. So Chinese security will expand a great deal. So but I also turn this around that as Taiwan is that what difference does it make if you are Republic of China or Republic of Taiwan? Absolutely no difference. Probably, sort of if you have to fight a war to become Republic of Taiwan, I would guess 80% of Taiwanese would not want to do this. They want to stay under. They don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China, but having to choose between a Republic of Taiwan, which is totally impossible, as long as China holds together, and Republic of Taiwan, that's not possible. Republic of China, which they have today, they will stay with Republic of China. That's why I think the Taiwanese voters have voted. They voted for Republic of China. They don't want to vote for a government that is going to take them down to a path to Republic of Taiwan because they know it's a dead end.